After my parents sold our family company for $600 million and threw me out like I meant nothing, they celebrated their victory a little too soon. What they did not realize was that their entire logistics system still depended on one single piece of code that only I controlled. Without my code, their billion-dollar deal with a tech giant was about to completely collapse. My name is Nia. I am 35 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the deep financial and emotional wounds my family inflicted on me. As a highly successful software developer, I spent 7 years building an empire I thought we all shared, only to be discarded the exact moment it became profitable. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to take credit for your hard work. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning in Atlanta. The sun was glaring off the towering glass facade of Vanguard Logistics, the company my father founded, but that I actually built from the ground up. I walk through the sliding double doors holding my usual iced coffee, mentally preparing to run a diagnostic test on our national routing servers. I approached the sleek steel turnstiles in the main lobby and tapped my security badge against the scanner. A harsh red light blinked. Access denied. I frowned, pulling the badge away and tapping it against the glass reader a second time. Access denied. A smug, grating voice echoed across the quiet marble floor of the lobby. Save your energy, Nia. That piece of plastic is as useless as your position here now. I turned around to see Trayvon, my 34-year-old brother-in-law, and the newly minted Chief Operating Officer of Vanguard. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, and a sickeningly arrogant smile was plastered across his face. Trailing right behind him were 4 armed security guards. Their hands were resting cautiously near their belts, treating me as if I were some kind of corporate spy instead of the woman who built their entire network. One of the heavy-set guards stepped forward and dropped a cheap, flimsy cardboard box right at my feet. Inside were a few scattered personal items from my desk down in the basement server room. There was a framed photo from my college graduation, a couple of stray coding manuals, and my favorite ceramic coffee mug. The sound of the cardboard box hitting the marble floor echoed loudly, drawing the attention of dozens of morning employees who were filtering into the lobby for their shifts. Trayvon stepped closer, deliberately invading my personal space. "You are fired, Nia. Pack up the rest of your trash and get out of my building." I stared at him. My heart was pounding furiously against my ribs, but I kept my facial expression entirely blank. "Your building?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and steady. "The last time I checked, you were just the guy who married my sister and managed to fail upward into an executive suite because you know how to play golf with my father. You do not have the legal authority to fire the lead systems architect of this company." Trayvon chuckled softly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Actually, I do. But if you want to hear it directly from the king and queen themselves, be my guest." Right on cue, the silver doors of the private executive elevator chimed and slid open. Out stepped my parents, Richard and Helena, walking alongside my younger sister Dominique. They looked like they had just stepped off the cover of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. Dominique, the undeniable golden child of our family, was wearing a pristine white designer dress. Her hair was perfectly pressed, and she was casually holding a half-empty glass of expensive champagne at 9 in the morning. My mother, Helena, adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, looking at me with that familiar mixture of pity and severe annoyance she had perfected over 3 decades. "Mom. Dad, what is going on here?" I asked, pointing to the armed security guards and the sad cardboard box sitting on the floor. "Trayvon just locked me out of the main system and told me I am fired." My father, Richard, stepped forward. He did not look angry or sympathetic. He looked triumphant, which was somehow much worse than anger. "Do not make a public scene, Nia," he said smoothly, using his best corporate boardroom voice. "Trayvon is simply executing our new restructuring plan. We did not want to do this in the middle of the lobby, but you always were so incredibly stubborn and difficult to manage." Restructuring. I repeated the word, tasting bitter in my mouth. My mother sighed heavily, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Nia. We just finalized the acquisition. Apex Global bought Vanguard Logistics this morning for $600 million. Dominique and Trevon closed the massive deal with their executives this past weekend at a private estate in Martha's Vineyard. It is a historic moment for this family, and we will not let your negative attitude ruin our celebration. I looked at Dominique, who was openly smirking at me from over the rim of her crystal glass. She held the title of Chief Marketing Officer, despite not knowing the first thing about logistics, corporate strategy, or software engineering. She spent her days doing photo shoots for business magazines and attending exclusive charity galas, soaking up the praise. Meanwhile, I spent the last 7 years in a windowless basement server room writing the complex predictive artificial intelligence that made this dying company attractive to a massive tech giant like Apex in the first place. You sold the company? I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as the reality set in. Dad, you promised me 20% equity. When I dropped out of my master's degree program at Spelman College 7 years ago, because this company was 2 weeks away from total bankruptcy, you begged me to come home. You looked me in the eye and said, if I built the automated routing system, if I saved your fading legacy, I would be a 20% partner in everything. Richard threw his head back and laughed. It was a cold, harsh sound that completely shattered whatever lingering illusion I had that this man saw me as a daughter rather than a disposable tool. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A verbal promise made under financial duress years ago holds absolutely no legal weight, Nia. You know that. We paid you a salary every month. You were an employee. And according to the standard contract you signed when you started your employment is strictly at will. That means we can terminate you at any time for any reason with zero equity and zero claims to any company assets. He handed the paper to Trayvon, who practically shoved it hard into my chest. I unfolded it slowly. It was a corporate severance check, $20,000. $20,000, I read aloud, staring blankly at the zeros. A $600 million buyout built entirely on the back of my logistics code, and you are handing me $20,000. Helena clicked her tongue in severe disapproval. It is a very generous transition package, Nia. Take the money, find a nice little IT job somewhere else, and learn to be grateful for what you have. You should be proud of your sister. Dominique is going to be a millionaire many times over today. She earned this lifestyle. Earned this, I snapped, finally letting a fraction of my boiling anger bleed through my calm exterior. Dominique has not logged into the company network in 6 months. Trayvon cannot even reboot his own laptop without calling my department for help. The only reason Apex Global looked at this dinosaur of a trucking company is because my specific algorithm reduced our fuel and routing costs by 40%. I am the system dad. Richard stepped right up to me using his height to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a vulnerable teenager. You are just a basement coder, Nia. You type on a keyboard. The adults in the room handled the real business. Now take your little box of toys and leave my property before I have security throw you out onto the pavement. The massive lobby went completely silent. The security guards shifted their weight uncomfortably. Dominique took another sip of her champagne, looking thoroughly entertained by my humiliation. Trayvon smiled brightly, crossing his arms over his chest. This was their big, glorious moment. They had successfully extracted all my value, used my brilliance to secure their own generational wealth, and were now sweeping me out the door like a piece of dirt on their expensive marble floors. I looked down at the pathetic check in my hand. I looked up at the pristine, smug faces of my so-called family. And then slowly I began to smile. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg. I did not give them the satisfaction of witnessing a public emotional breakdown. Instead, I carefully folded the $20,000 check and slipped it into the pocket of my blazer. I bent down, picked up my framed college graduation photo from the cardboard box, and left the rest of the trash sitting on the floor. I really hope Apex Global did a very thorough job with their due diligence, I said calmly, looking directly into my father's eyes. My father frowned slightly, a brief flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his face. What is that supposed to mean? He demanded, his corporate voice faltering for just a second. I did not answer him. I simply turned my back on all of them and walked confidently toward the revolving glass doors. As I pushed through to the outside, feeling the warm Atlanta morning air hit my face, I pulled my cell phone from my purse. I opened a hidden, highly encrypted application I had built years ago, long before Vanguard was ever profitable. A single line of text appeared on the black screen, waiting for my final command. I typed out 4 simple words: Revoke Access API Key. I hit execute. Before I even reached my car in the parking lot, I heard a massive collective gasp from the lobby behind me. I stopped and looked over my shoulder. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the building, I could see the massive 2-story digital routing screens that displayed all of Vanguard's national logistics in real time. One by one, the glowing maps, the moving truck icons, and the endless data streams froze in place. They glitched wildly for a fraction of a second, and then every single monitor in the building went completely violently black. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the temperature inside the Vanguard Logistics Executive Suite was supposedly set to a comfortable 70 degrees. However, Trayvon was sweating so profusely that his custom-tailored light gray suit was already clinging to his back. The massive $600 million acquisition by Apex Global was supposed to be his crowning achievement. He had spent the last 3 months playing golf with the Apex executives, bragging about the flawless state-of-the-art artificial intelligence routing system that made Vanguard the most efficient fleet on the East Coast. Now standing in the glass-walled server control room, Trayvon was watching his entire corporate future disintegrate into thin air. 5 senior engineers from the Apex integration team were standing behind him with their arms crossed. They had flown in on a red-eye flight from Silicon Valley, specifically to begin migrating the legendary logistics code into the Apex mainframe. Instead of a seamless transition, they were staring at hundreds of blank monitors displaying a single glowing red line of text. Missing core algorithm. Trayvon frantically mashed the keys on the master terminal, pushing the lead IT technician out of the way. "What do you mean it is missing?" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Code does not just get up and walk away. Find the backups. Pull the redundancy servers online right now." The terrified technician pushed his glasses up his nose, his hands shaking over the keyboard. "Sir, I have checked every single sector. There are no backups. The entire predictive routing architecture was completely wiped from our local drives the second Nia swiped her badge yesterday. The system is entirely hollow. We have the trucks and the warehouses, but the brain is completely gone." The lead engineer from Apex, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, stepped forward. Her tone was dangerously calm. "Trayvon, we did not pay $600 million for a fleet of old diesel trucks. We paid for the predictive algorithm. If we cannot access the core architecture by the end of the day, our legal team will consider this a material breach of contract. We need that code online, now." Trayvon swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Give me 5 minutes," he stammered, stepping out of the server room and pulling his phone from his pocket. His hands were trembling so badly he almost dropped the device. He scrolled furiously through his contacts and pressed the call button. Miles away, I was sitting at a quiet corner table of my favorite boutique cafe in Midtown. The morning sun was streaming through the large windows, casting a warm glow over my laptop screen. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced oat milk latte, savoring the rich flavor of the espresso. I had slept a full 8 hours for the first time in 7 years. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's constant demands was finally gone. When my phone began vibrating on the table, I did not rush to answer it. I let it ring. I watched the caller ID flash Trayvon's name until the very last second before it went to voicemail, and then I casually swiped the green accept button. "Hello, Trayvon," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and unbothered. "How is the restructuring going?" "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Trayvon screamed into the receiver. He was breathing heavily, sounding like a wild animal caught in a trap. "I know exactly what you did. You hacked the mainframe before you left. You planted a virus or a logic bomb in the servers to hold us hostage. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in? I have our corporate lawyers on standby. I'm going to call the FBI. I am going to have you thrown in federal prison for cyber terrorism if you do not restore the access keys right this second. I gently set my coffee cup down on the wooden table and leaned back in my chair. You are projecting, Trayvon, I replied calmly. Hacking implies unauthorized access. I did not hack anything. I simply logged out. And when I left the building, I took my personal property with me just as you ordered. You told me to pack up my toys. So I did. What are you talking about? He yelled, his voice echoing slightly in what sounded like an empty hallway. The routing system is company property. You built it while you were working for Vanguard. That means Vanguard owns it. It is called intellectual property NIA. Try reading a law book sometime instead of typing in a dark basement. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Oh, Trayvon. For a chief operating officer, you really have a terrible habit of signing documents without reading them. I did not build the core algorithm while working at Vanguard. I built it in my dorm room at Spelman College 2 years before Dad ever offered me a job. The line went dead silent for a moment. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as the panic deepened. I continued, clearly articulating every word so there could be no misunderstanding. The predictive AI, the machine learning models, the exact code that Apex just paid $600 million for, it was never Vanguard property. It belongs entirely to Encore Limited Liability Company, a company that I registered, copyrighted, and wholly own. That is a lie, Trayvon fired back, though his voice was noticeably weaker now. We paid you a salary to develop it. You paid me a salary to maintain the hardware and run the IT department, I corrected him. As for the algorithm itself, if you go down to the legal archives and pull the contract Dad forced me to sign 7 years ago, you will find a very specific licensing addendum on page 42. Because Dad refused to give me the 20% equity he promised, I refused to hand over the copyright. Instead, Vanguard Logistics has been leasing the software from Encore LLC on a rolling monthly contract for the grand total of $1 a month. I paused, letting the crushing reality of the situation wash over him. And since Dad made it very clear yesterday that my employment was strictly at will and that all ties between us were officially severed, my company chose to terminate the lease agreement. The software is mine. You just sold a tech company without actually owning any of the tech. Trayvon was breathing raggedly into the phone. Nia, please, he choked out completely, dropping the aggressive facade. You cannot do this. The Apex team is standing right here. If they find out we do not own the IP, they will pull the deal. My entire career is riding on this. Dominique and I just put an offer on a massive house in Buckhead based on this payout. Tell me what you want. You want 50,000, 100,000, I will wire it to you right now out of my own pocket. Just turn the screens back on. I smiled at the desperation in his voice. You fired me, Trayvon. And as my father so eloquently put it, a verbal promise under financial duress holds no legal weight. Have a wonderful morning. I ended the call and blocked his number. I picked up my latte, opened my laptop, and went back to browsing real estate listings in California. I knew Trayvon's ego would not allow him to accept defeat that easily. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats always make incredibly stupid decisions. Back at the Vanguard headquarters, Trayvon stared at his dead phone, his face pale and slick with sweat. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and stormed back into the server control room. The Apex engineers were still waiting, looking at their watches. Move, Trayvon ordered the lead IT technician, physically shoving the young man out of the server chair. The girl thinks she is smart. She just locked the front door, but she left the back door wide open. I am going to override the firewall manually. The technician stumbled back, his eyes widening in horror. Sir, please do not do that. We do not fully understand the security architecture she built. If you attempt a brute force override without the master encryption key, the system might interpret it as a hostile intrusion. I am the chief operating officer of this company. Trayvon barked, slamming his hands onto the keyboard. I do not take orders from a basement nerd. Ignoring all protocol and basic common sense, Trayvon opened the administrative command terminal. He bypassed the standard login screen and initiated a forceful reboot of the primary servers, attempting to strip away the security layers I had carefully put in place. He typed in his executive override credentials and slammed the enter key with a triumphant smirk. For 2 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then a piercing high-pitched alarm began to blare from the overhead speakers in the server room. The red error message on the hundreds of monitors vanished, replaced instantly by a blinding white screen displaying a solid black padlock icon. "What did you do?" the Apex lead engineer demanded, stepping forward as the alarms echoed down the hallway. Trevon frantically mashed the escape key, but the keyboard was entirely unresponsive. The cooling fans on the massive server towers began to roar, spinning at maximum capacity as the entire network went into full defensive lockdown. The IT technician grabbed his tablet, his face draining of all color. "Sir, it is a catastrophic failsafe. By attempting a brute force override, you triggered a localized purge. The firewall did not just lock down the logistics code, it has completely encrypted the entire Vanguard customer database. Client manifest financial records, billing histories, active shipment coordinates. Everything is gone behind military-grade encryption." Trevon froze, his hands hovering over the useless keyboard. The smug confidence that had defined his entire personality completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, incompetent man who had just destroyed a $600 million empire in a matter of seconds. The Apex integration team did not yell or panic. They were Silicon Valley veterans, and they recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. Sarah, the lead engineer, calmly closed her laptop and placed it into her leather bag. She looked at Trevon with absolute disgust. "Our legal team will be in contact within the hour. Apex is officially freezing the acquisition funds. You have exactly 24 hours to produce the core algorithm and unencrypt the customer database. If you fail to do so, we will not only cancel the buyout, but we will sue Vanguard Logistics and its executive board personally for criminal fraud and breach of contract." Without waiting for a response, Sarah and her team turned and walked out of the server room, leaving Trevon standing completely alone in a sea of locked screens and blaring alarms. The 24-hour countdown had officially begun, and my family was about to learn that they could not bully their way out of a problem they could not even understand. The 24-hour countdown from Apex had expired on Wednesday morning, sending Vanguard Logistics into a chaotic tailspin. By the time Sunday arrived, the tension had reached a boiling point. I knew my family would be looking for me, and I knew exactly where they would expect to find me. Every Sunday morning for the past 10 years, I attended service at one of the oldest and most prestigious historic Black churches in Atlanta. It was a place where the city's elite gathered. Mayors, judges, corporate executives, and wealthy entrepreneurs all mingled in the pews and the sprawling parking lot. My parents treated church less like a place of worship and more like a weekly networking event to showcase their perfect family image. The service was beautiful, but my mind was completely focused on the inevitable confrontation waiting for me outside. When the final benediction was given, I gathered my purse and walked out the heavy oak doors into the bright, humid Atlanta afternoon. The parking lot was filled with luxury cars and people chatting in their tailored suits and vibrant Sunday hats. I did not even make it to my car before I heard her voice. "Nia, how could you do this to us?" I stopped and slowly turned around. Dominique was marching across the asphalt wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress, with Trevon trailing anxiously close behind her. My parents, Richard and Helena, flanked them like two heavily armed guards. Dominique's voice was intentionally loud, designed to cut through the post-service chatter and draw an audience. Several heads turned in our direction. Deacons and choir members paused their conversations to watch the drama unfold. Dominique stopped a few feet away from me, her eyes brimming with perfectly manufactured tears. "We are your family, Nia," she cried out, her voice trembling with theatrical betrayal. "How could you be so incredibly jealous of my success that you would try to sabotage the biggest deal in Vanguard history? Trevon told us you locked down the entire system out of spite. You are trying to ruin our legacy just because you are bitter that I was promoted instead of you." The sheer audacity of her performance was almost impressive. She was playing the victim flawlessly, painting me as the disgruntled, jealous older sister who could not handle her younger sibling's shining success. I saw a few church elders whispering to each other, their eyes darting between Dominique's tears and my calm posture. Before I could even respond to Dominique, my mother stepped forward. Helena was wearing a flawless white suit and a wide-brimmed hat. She did not yell. Instead, she used a weapon much more dangerous than shouting. She used the toxic, suffocating guilt of familial obligation. "Nia, please," my mother said, keeping her tone smooth and pleading for the benefit of the onlookers. "We are all deeply hurt by your actions, but we are willing to forgive you. You have always been our strong girl. You have always been the one who could shoulder the hard work behind the scenes. That is your gift. As Black women, we have to stick together. We have to sacrifice for the greater good of our family. You know how hard your father and I worked to build generational wealth in a world that always wants to see us fail. Why are you tearing down your own people? Why are you being so selfish?" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was the exact same psychological manipulation she had used on me for my entire life. She was weaponizing my identity and twisting the concept of loyalty to make me feel guilty for simply demanding what was rightfully mine. She wanted me to be the strong Black woman who silently carried the heavy burdens so that Dominique could effortlessly wear the glittering crown. I looked around the sprawling parking lot. Dozens of influential people were watching us, waiting to see if I would bow my head, apologize, and fall back into my designated place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I took a deep, steadying breath, adjusting the leather strap of my purse on my shoulder. "I am not being selfish, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet parking lot so that every single person watching could hear me. "I am simply enforcing a firm boundary that you all consciously chose to cross." I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents. I had printed the official copyright registration for Encore LLC, along with the $1 a month licensing agreement my father had signed 7 years ago. I held the papers up high, making sure the bright red federal copyright seal was visible in the bright afternoon sunlight. "This is the core algorithm that runs Vanguard Logistics," I said, looking directly at my father, whose face was rapidly losing its color. "I did not steal it. I did not hack it. I own it. I have owned it since I was 20 years old. You built a trucking company, Dad. But I built the artificial intelligence that made it worth $600 million. And instead of honoring the 20% equity you promised me, you fired me on Tuesday morning and tried to hand me a $20,000 severance check." The whispers in the parking lot suddenly shifted. The sympathetic looks that were previously directed at Dominique were now transforming into expressions of shock and harsh judgment aimed directly at my parents. Dominique let out a dramatic, frustrated sigh, dropping the crying act completely. "Oh, please, Nia. You are just a coder. You sit in a basement all day. I am the chief marketing officer. I am the face of the brand. I secured the Apex deal." I turned my attention to my sister, stepping right into her personal space. "You are the face of a brand you do not even remotely understand, Dominique. I read your glowing feature in Forbes magazine last month. The one where you claimed you personally spearheaded the transition to automated machine learning logistics." I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Tell me, Dominique, tell me, what programming language is the routing core written in? Is it Python? Is it C++? Dominique opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She blinked rapidly, her perfectly manicured hands fluttering nervously in the air. Well, the engineering team handles the minor technical specifics," she stammered, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red as the church members watched her stumble. "You do not know," I said sharply, cutting her off, "because you have never written a single line of code in your entire life. You took the credit for my late nights, my missed weekends, and my pure exhaustion. You paraded around in designer clothes while I kept this company from going completely bankrupt. I was never your sister. I was your unpaid help, but the help just resigned, and I took my property with me." I turned back to my parents. The illusion of their perfect, successful family was completely shattering right here in the church parking lot. "Apex is demanding the software." I continued, my voice echoing off the brick walls of the church building. "But Vanguard does not own it. If you want my algorithm, you will have to buy it from me at its actual market value. Until then, the servers stay locked." My father's face turned a violent shade of purple. The thick veins in his neck were bulging against his stiff white collar. He realized, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life, that he could not intimidate me into blind submission. He could not use his booming voice or his corporate authority to make me back down. I held all the cards, and I was exposing his fraudulent business practices in front of his peers, his wealthy golfing buddies, and his fellow church members. "You ungrateful little witch," Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious, hateful whisper that only our family could hear. "I gave you a roof over your head. I paid for your food. You owe me your life." "I do not owe you anything," I replied calmly. "You fired an at-will employee. Now you have to deal with the severe consequences of losing your absolute best vendor. Have a truly blessed Sunday." I turned around and began walking toward my car. The crowd of churchgoers silently parted to let me through, their eyes wide with disbelief at the spectacle they had just witnessed. I had only taken 10 steps when I heard my mother's voice. It was no longer smooth or pleading. It was entirely devoid of warmth, sounding exactly like cold steel. "Richard, do not argue with her anymore," Helena said loudly, making sure I heard every single word. She pulled her latest smartphone from her designer purse and dialed a number with sharp, angry jabs of her finger. She held the phone to her ear, her eyes drilling right into the back of my head. "Yes, Charles, this is Helena," she said, speaking to their lead corporate attorney. "I need you to file an emergency injunction against my daughter Naya, claim corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. Yes, whatever it takes to ruin her." I paused with my hand on the door handle of my car, listening to the absolute ruthlessness of the woman who had given birth to me. "And Charles?" My mother added, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "Call our top contacts at the bank. I want every single one of her accounts frozen by tomorrow morning. If she wants to play hardball and humiliate this family in public, then we will systematically take everything she has. Let us starve her out." Monday morning arrived with a harsh dose of reality. I sat at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee, opening my laptop to take care of my monthly expenses. I logged into my primary banking portal to transfer my rent payment and clear my credit card balances. Instead of my usual account dashboard, my screen was completely blank, save for a stark red banner across the top. "Account frozen. Please contact your branch administrator." I picked up my phone and dialed the premium customer service line. After a few minutes on hold, a nervous-sounding representative came on the line. "I am sorry, Ms. Nia, but your accounts have been locked down completely. We received a court-ordered emergency injunction early this morning. The freeze was initiated by a corporate legal team representing Vanguard Logistics. They have filed a preliminary claim of intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. Until a judge reviews the case, we cannot authorize a single withdrawal." I ended the call and set my phone down on the marble counter. My mother was not making empty threats in that church parking lot. She and my father had leveraged their elite social connections to wake up a friendly judge on a Sunday night and push through a malicious emergency order. They wanted to cut off my oxygen. They wanted me to wake up on Monday morning completely terrified, unable to buy groceries or pay my rent, so I would come crawling back to them on my knees, begging for mercy. What they did not know was that I had been preparing for my exit for over a year. I had a secondary account with a separate credit union that they knew nothing about, funded entirely by my independent freelance consulting work. I was not going to starve. But the sheer vindictiveness of their actions solidified every single boundary I had ever built against them. Before I could even process the bank freeze, my phone began vibrating continuously against the counter. A flood of text messages was pouring in from our extended family group chats. The smear campaign had officially launched. My parents had clearly spent their Sunday evening spinning a tragic narrative to every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our sprawling family tree. Aunt Beatrice sent a lengthy paragraph calling me a selfish traitor. "How could you try to steal from your own parents after everything they have provided for you? You are ruining your grandfather's legacy over petty jealousy." My cousin Marcus texted right after her. "I always knew you were bitter that Dominique got the executive position, but holding the company hostage is a federal crime, Nia. You need to fix this before you end up in prison." They were all blindly taking the word of my parents. None of them bothered to ask for my side of the story. None of them knew about the unpaid overtime, the stolen credit, or the legal copyright I held. To them, I was just the difficult, rebellious daughter trying to ruin a historic payday for the entire family. I did not bother replying to a single one of them. I simply muted the conversation and tossed my phone onto the sofa. A sharp knock at my front door interrupted the silence of my apartment. I walked over and looked through the peephole to see a man in a plain gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. I opened the door. "Are you Nia?" he asked flatly. "Yes," I replied. "You have been served," he said, pressing the heavy envelope into my hands before turning around and walking quickly down the hallway. I closed the door and tore open the envelope. It was a formal cease and desist letter from Vanguard Logistics' lead corporate attorney. It was heavily padded with aggressive legal jargon threatening me with a $100 million civil lawsuit for breach of contract, corporate sabotage, and extortion. The letter demanded that I immediately surrender the administrative access codes to the logistics software within 12 hours, or they would move forward with total financial ruin. I read through the threats and tossed the useless paperwork into my recycling bin. It was nothing but a scare tactic. They knew they did not own the software, and they knew an actual court battle would take months of discovery, months they absolutely did not have. Apex Global had given them a strict 24-hour deadline. Lawsuits take time, and time was the one currency my family was completely out of. My theory was proven entirely correct 3 hours later. My phone rang and my father's private cell number flashed across the screen. I let it ring 4 times before finally answering. "Nia," my father said. His voice was completely different from the booming authoritative tone he had used at the office and the church. He sounded exhausted. He sounded like a man who had spent the entire morning being yelled at by angry billionaires. "Hello, Dad? Did you call to check if I am starving yet?" I asked dryly. He sighed deeply into the receiver. "Let us stop this nonsense, Nia. The lawyers are just going to drain everyone's bank accounts. This emergency injunction, the lawsuits, it is all getting out of hand. We are a family. We should not be communicating through process servers." "You literally sent a process server to my house 2 hours ago," I pointed out. "I know, and I am calling to put an end to it," he said smoothly, pivoting back into his natural role as the grand negotiator. "Apex is getting incredibly impatient. They want to start the system migration tomorrow. I want you to come meet me, your mother, and your sister for dinner tonight. Let us put the legal threats away, sit down like adults, and hammer out a fair compromise." "A compromise?" I asked, testing the waters. "Yes, a clean slate. I booked a private dining room at the Capitol Grill in Buckhead for 7 o'clock tonight, just the 4 of us. We want to make this right, Nia. Will you come?" I stared at the city skyline outside my window. I knew exactly what this was. It was a fake olive branch. They had realized the legal route would take too long to appease Apex, so they were changing tactics. They were going to try and buy me off with a fraction of what my work was actually worth, hoping I was terrified enough by the frozen bank accounts and the family blacklist to take whatever crumbs they offered. "I will be there," I said quietly. "Good. We will see you at 7, he replied, sounding profoundly relieved before hanging up. I spent the next few hours making sure my own legal documentation was in perfect order. But more importantly, I made one very specific anonymous phone call. If my family wanted to have a private negotiation regarding the sale of intellectual property tied to a $600 million acquisition, I wanted to ensure the right people were secretly in the room to hear exactly how they conducted their business. At exactly 7 o'clock, I walked through the heavy oak doors of the Capitol Grill in Buckhead. The restaurant was an exclusive, dimly lit sanctuary for Atlanta's wealthy elite. The air smelled of expensive steaks, aged bourbon, and old money. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded private dining room in the back, shielded from the main floor by thick velvet curtains. My parents and Dominique were already seated around a polished mahogany table. They were all dressed impeccably, exuding an aura of calm, calculated wealth. Trevon was noticeably absent, likely back at the office, sweating over the locked servers and trying to buy more time with the Apex integration team. "Nia, please sit down," my mother said, offering a warm, perfectly practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She gestured to the empty leather chair across from her. "I ordered your favorite sparkling water." I sat down, placing my purse carefully on the floor next to me. I did not touch the water. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Mother. You froze my checking accounts and sent your lawyers to my home. What exactly is the compromise we are discussing today? My father cleared his throat, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. Nia, we admit that we underestimated your attachment to this little software project of yours. We recognize that you put a lot of hard work into it over the years. But you have to understand the position you have put us in. Apex is demanding the full package, and we simply do not have the time to go back and forth in court to prove Vanguard's rightful ownership of the copyright. Rightful ownership, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. You mean the copyright that is legally registered under my personal LLC? My father waved his hand dismissively. Legal technicalities can be debated forever. But we do not want to fight you. We want everyone to walk away happy. We want to reward you for your contribution to the family business. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. He placed it on the mahogany table and slowly slid it across to my side. I opened the folder. Inside was a standard intellectual property transfer agreement. It was drawn up perfectly, requiring me to completely surrender all rights, source code, and administrative access for Encore LLC over to Vanguard Logistics. I scanned down to the compensation clause. $1 million. I stared at the number printed on the heavy cardstock. $1 million in exchange for the exact algorithm that was securing them a $600 million payday. They wanted to hand me a tiny fraction of a single percent while they walked away with generational wealth built entirely on my genius. They sat there watching me in silence, expecting me to be overwhelmed by the offer. They expected the girl they had emotionally beaten down her entire life to cry tears of gratitude for this incredible sum of money. Dominique leaned back in her chair, swirling her glass of red wine. A smug, condescending smile spread across her perfectly contoured face. "Just sign the paper, Nia," she said, her tone dripping with absolute arrogance. "Let us be realistic here. Take the million. It is more money than a basement coder will ever see in a lifetime. You can buy yourself a nice little house in the suburbs and leave the real corporate business to us." I stared at Dominique, letting her arrogant words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. Then I looked down at the contract again. I read the clauses, the neatly typed legal jargon, the restrictive covenants, and the single $1 million figure sitting at the bottom of the page. I felt a bubble of genuine amusement rise in my chest. I tried to suppress it, but I could not. I tilted my head back and burst out laughing. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a loud, echoing laugh that bounced off the mahogany-paneled walls of the private dining room. My parents exchanged nervous glances. Dominique's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep defensive scowl. "What is so funny?" she snapped, gripping the stem of her wineglass so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We are offering you a lifeline, Nia. You should be on your knees thanking us right now. You are holding up a historic payday over your own petty grudges." I wiped a tear of laughter from the corner of my eye and tossed the black leather folder back across the table. It slid to a stop right in front of my father, the crisp pages spilling out slightly. "I am not laughing at the insulting amount of money you are offering me, Dominique. I am laughing because you all are so blinded by your own greed, so desperate to cover your tracks, that you do not even realize you just handed me the exact rope you are going to use to hang yourselves." My father sat up completely straight, his corporate negotiator mask slipping to reveal the anxious man underneath. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice thick with tension. "It is a standard intellectual property transfer agreement. Our top corporate lawyers drafted it this afternoon. It is airtight. It protects you from liability, and it gives us the code. It is a win for everyone." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, closing the physical distance between us. "It might be airtight, Dad, but it is completely out of sync with the massive contract you signed with Apex Global this past weekend in Martha's Vineyard. Have you actually read your own master buyout agreement? Because I guarantee you the Apex integration team did." My mother shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her expensive jewelry clinking softly. "Stop talking in riddles, Nia. We do not have time for your games. Just sign the document, take the $1 million, and we will call off the lawyers tomorrow morning. We will lift the freeze on your bank accounts and you can go back to your life." I shook my head slowly, looking directly into my father's eyes. When you finalized a $600 million acquisition with a massive tech giant like Apex, you were required to sign a very specific document called an Intellectual Property Indemnity Clause. It is standard operating procedure for any tech-based corporate merger. In that clause, you swore under penalty of perjury that Vanguard Logistics held 100% unencumbered ownership of all software algorithms and technical architecture being transferred in the sale. You legally certified that there were no outstanding claims, no third-party licenses, and absolutely no hidden owners. My father's face suddenly went entirely slack. The confident color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Exactly, I said softly, watching the crushing realization hit him like a freight train. If I sign this buyout contract right now, dated today, it creates an undeniable legally binding paper trail. It proves on paper that Vanguard Logistics did not actually own the core algorithm when you signed the Apex paperwork on Saturday. It proves you lied to their board of directors. It proves you committed federal wire fraud and commercial deception to secure a $600 million payout. If I take this $1 million today, I become a willing accessory to your felony. Silence fell over the private dining room. The faint sound of smooth jazz music playing out in the main restaurant seemed a million miles away. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. "You are bluffing," Dominique said, her voice shaking slightly as she looked back and forth between me and our parents. She looked at our father for reassurance, waiting for him to tell me I was wrong, but he was just staring blankly at the black leather folder, like it was a live explosive device sitting on his dinner plate. "I am not bluffing," I replied, my voice steady, calm, and icy cold. "I am simply reading the chessboard much better than you are. You tried to starve me out by freezing my bank accounts first thing this morning. You tried to turn my entire extended family against me with a coordinated smear campaign. And when that did not work fast enough because the clock was ticking, you tried to trap me into a fraudulent contract. I am not signing anything. I am not taking your $1 million. And I am definitely not saving you from the catastrophic legal mess you created for yourselves." At that exact moment, before anyone could formulate a response, the heavy velvet curtain separating our private room from the main dining floor was violently thrown open. Trayvon stumbled into the room. He looked absolutely terrible. The pristine, custom-tailored suit he had been wearing all week was rumpled and stained with sweat, and his expensive silk tie was completely undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His eyes were wide with pure panic. He had clearly rushed straight from the Vanguard headquarters, completely abandoning his post in the server room. Richard Trevon gasped, clutching the back of an empty leather chair to steady himself. He was breathing so heavily he could barely get the words out. "The Apex integration team just gave us a final warning. Their legal department is drafting the breach of contract papers as we speak. If we do not have the encryption keys by midnight tonight, they are freezing the escrow accounts and walking away entirely. They are going to sue us for damages." My father did not look at Trayvon. He did not even flinch at the news. He just kept his eyes fixed strictly on the black folder on the table. "She will not sign it," my father said, his voice hollow, gravelly, and entirely defeated. "She knows about the indemnity clause." Trayvon's head snapped toward me, his face contorting with a sudden violent rage that I had never seen from him before. "What do you mean she will not sign it?" he yelled, stepping toward the table, his professional demeanor completely shattered. "Make her sign it. We are losing everything. My massive new house in Buckhead is on the line. My entire career is over if this deal falls through. Nobody is making me do anything, Trayvon," I said, firmly refusing to break eye contact with him or show even a fraction of fear. "I told you on the phone this morning, you do not own the code. And now you are completely out of time." Dominique suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly and aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. "You ruined everything," she screamed, completely abandoning her polished socialite persona. Her face was twisted in ugly, raw fury. "You have always been jealous of me. You have always hated that I was the favorite child. You are doing this just to destroy my life. This is all your fault." Without warning, she grabbed her crystal glass of expensive red wine and hurled it directly at me across the table. I managed to turn my shoulder just in time, but the dark red liquid splashed across the lapel of my beige blazer and shattered violently against the mahogany-paneled wall right behind me. The sound of breaking crystal was shockingly loud in the enclosed, intimate space. Dark red wine dripped down the expensive wallpaper like blood. Helena gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. But she did not reprimand Dominique. She did not ask if I was okay. She just sat there in silence, paralyzed, watching her perfect, carefully curated family implode in real time. Trevin did not stop at throwing wine. The violence in the room seemed to push him over the edge. He lunged around the heavy wooden table, his hands balled into tight fists, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated desperation. He was a cornered animal, completely stripped of his corporate power, and he was ready to use physical intimidation to force me into compliance. "You are going to give me those access codes right now, Nia," Trevon growled, stepping so close to me I could smell the stale coffee and nervous sour sweat radiating off his suit. "You are not walking out of this private room until you unlock those servers and save my career." I stood up slowly, keeping my body perfectly still, refusing to back down a single inch. I was not afraid of Trayvon. I knew he was a coward at his core, a man who only felt powerful when he had a title to hide behind. "If you touch me," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady, "I promise you, the federal fraud charges will be the absolute least of your problems." Trevon raised his hand, his eyes wild, stepping forward to physically grab my arm. Before his fingers could even graze my sleeve, a calm, deeply authoritative voice cut through the heavy chaos of the room. "I highly recommend you step away from the young lady, sir." Trevon froze instantly. We all turned our heads toward the opening of the heavy velvet curtain. Sitting at the very next booth, previously completely hidden from our view by the thick fabric partition, was a man in a sharp, impeccably tailored gray suit. He had been there the entire time. He had been quietly eating his expensive steak and listening intently to every single word spoken, every threat made, and every admission of guilt in our private dining room. The man picked up a crisp white linen napkin and deliberately wiped his mouth. He placed the napkin gently on his empty plate, stood up, and slowly walked into our enclosed space. He ignored Trevon completely, brushing past him as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He ignored Dominique, who was staring at him in open-mouthed shock. And he ignored my parents, who were suddenly frozen in their seats like statues. He walked straight over to the mahogany table and reached into the inner pocket of his gray suit jacket. He pulled out a thick embossed business card and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table right next to the fraudulent $1 million contract my father had just tried to force me to sign. The man looked down at my father, his expression completely devoid of any warmth, sympathy, or negotiation. "My name is David Preston," the man said, his voice crisp, cold, and intensely professional. "I am the lead mergers and acquisitions auditor for Apex Global. And I must say, Richard, this has been one of the most enlightening dinner conversations of my entire career. I received an anonymous tip earlier today, suggesting I might want to dine at the Capitol Grill this evening, and I am very glad I took the recommendation." The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. My father looked like he was going to have a massive heart attack right there in his leather chair. Trayvon slowly backed away from me, his hands dropping to his sides, the fight completely and utterly draining out of his body. David Preston buttoned his suit jacket and adjusted his cufflinks, projecting the ultimate corporate authority. "We have a strict zero-tolerance policy for commercial deception," he continued, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Lying on an intellectual property indemnity clause is not just a simple breach of contract, Richard. As your brilliant daughter so accurately pointed out just moments ago, it is a federal crime. Apex Global does not do business with liars, and we certainly do not do business with fraudsters." He tapped his index finger once very deliberately on his embossed business card resting on the table. "The $600 million acquisition of Vanguard Logistics is officially suspended indefinitely, pending a full legal investigation by our corporate fraud division. Do not attempt to contact our executives again. Our legal team will be serving you with the formal cancellation papers, as well as a demand for the immediate return of our $50 million good faith deposit tomorrow morning. Have a pleasant evening. David Preston did not immediately leave after delivering his devastating verdict. He stood there in the center of the private dining room, letting the absolute magnitude of his words crush the remaining oxygen out of the space. Richard tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He reached for his water glass with trembling fingers, knocking it against the polished mahogany table and spilling cold water and ice cubes directly over the fraudulent $1 million contract he had just tried to force me to sign. "David, please," my father finally choked out. His voice was completely stripped of every ounce of its usual booming corporate authority. He sounded like a terrified old man. "You are misunderstanding the situation. This is merely a private family dispute. It is a minor internal misunderstanding regarding software licensing. We can clear this up right now. Let me call your CEO. Let me explain." David Preston looked at my father with a level of utter disgust, usually reserved for scraping something foul off the bottom of a shoe. "There is no misunderstanding, Richard." David said, his tone remaining perfectly flat and professional, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "I have been sitting in the booth directly behind that velvet curtain for the past 45 minutes. I heard you attempt to extort your own daughter. I heard you openly acknowledge that she legally owns the core algorithm. I heard your son-in-law admit that your system is currently locked and that your logistics company is essentially an empty, worthless shell. And most importantly, I heard you try to force a backdated intellectual property transfer to cover up the undeniable fact that you lied on a federal indemnity document." My father gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "David, we have done business together for months," he pleaded, sweat now visibly beading on his forehead. "You know my character. You know Vanguard Logistics is a solid investment." "Your character is precisely why the deal is dead," David snapped back, finally letting a fraction of his anger show. "Do you honestly think Apex Global became a Silicon Valley giant by allowing mediocre businessmen to swindle us? We received an anonymous email this afternoon containing a certified copy of the Encore LLC copyright registration, along with a copy of your monthly $1 licensing lease. The email suggested I dine at the Capitol Grill tonight to hear the truth for myself. I thought it might be a competitor trying to sabotage the acquisition. I never imagined you would be foolish enough to confess to commercial fraud in a public restaurant." David adjusted his briefcase, looking down at the ruined, waterlogged contract on the table. "You thought you could pull a fast one on a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. You thought you could sell us stolen property. You are completely out of your depth, Richard. Prepare your legal defense because our lawyers will be ruthless." My mother Helena let out a soft, high-pitched whimper, covering her face with both hands. Dominique was completely frozen, her eyes darting frantically between David Preston and our father, slowly realizing that her promised millions, her magazine covers, and her elite socialite future had just evaporated into thin air. Trayvon was leaning heavily against the back of his chair, staring blankly at the floor. He looked physically ill, as if he might be sick right there on the expensive hardwood. David Preston turned on his heel and walked out of the private dining room, pushing past the heavy velvet curtain without looking back. The sound of his leather dress shoes clicking against the floor faded into the smooth jazz music of the main restaurant, leaving behind a silence so absolute it was deafening. I remained standing at the table. I looked at the four of them, taking in the complete and total destruction of their arrogant empire. Just 24 hours ago, they had stood in the marble lobby of Vanguard Logistics, flanked by armed security guards, treating me like disposable trash. They had handed me a $20,000 check and told me to be grateful. They had frozen my bank accounts and sent process servers to my home to intimidate me. Now the grand illusion was completely shattered. They were entirely ruined, and they had done it entirely to themselves. "Nia," my mother whispered, lowering her hands from her face. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror. "Nia, what have you done? You invited him here. You set us up." "I did not set you up, Mother," I replied, my voice completely calm and steady. I simply provided an audience for your natural behavior. You chose to lie to Apex. You chose to forge a fraudulent contract. You chose to throw a glass of wine at me, Dominique. And you chose to try and physically assault me, Trevon. I did not make any of you do those things. I just made sure the right person was listening when you did. You ruined us. My father breathed heavily, clutching his chest. The $50 million deposit. We do not have it in liquid cash anymore. I used it to pay off the hidden corporate debts so the Vanguard books would look clean for the Apex auditors. I used it to secure Trayvon and Dominique's new estate in Buckhead. If they demand it back tomorrow morning, the company will instantly go into default. The banks will seize everything. I reached into my leather purse. I bypassed my frozen credit cards and pulled out a crisp $20 bill from my wallet. I placed it gently on the mahogany table right next to my untouched glass of sparkling water. That sounds like an executive management problem, Dad, I said smoothly. And since you fired me yesterday morning and proudly declared that I am strictly an at-will employee with zero equity and zero claims to company assets, Vanguard's financial default is officially none of my business. I picked up my purse, stepped over the shards of broken crystal and spilled red wine on the floor, and walked toward the exit. Fix this! Trevon suddenly yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic as he lunged forward, grabbing the back of my blazer. You have to fix this, Nia. Turn the servers back on. Call David Preston and tell him it was a joke. Tell him you lied about the copyright. I stopped walking. I slowly turned my head and looked down at Trayvon's hand clutching my jacket. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. Let go of me, Trayvon. I said, every syllable dripping with absolute ice. Or I will make sure the police add physical battery to your growing list of federal charges. Trayvon yanked his hand back as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a pathetic, cowardly fear. I turned my back on my family for the final time that evening. I walked out of the private room through the elegant, softly lit main dining floor of the Capitol Grill and stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. I took a deep breath of the evening air. For the first time in my entire life, my shoulders did not carry the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I was completely free. The next morning, the sun rose over the glass headquarters of Vanguard Logistics, just like it did every other day. But the atmosphere inside the building was anything but normal. At exactly 9:00 in the morning, a fleet of 6 sleek black SUVs pulled into the circular driveway of the Vanguard corporate campus. The vehicles parked in a synchronized, aggressive formation, completely blocking the main entrance. The heavy doors opened simultaneously, and a dozen men and women wearing sharp, charcoal gray suits stepped out onto the pavement. They were not investors. They were not tech engineers. They were high-powered corporate litigators and registered process servers representing the formidable legal division of Apex Global. They marched through the sliding glass doors of the lobby, completely ignoring the confused security guards who tried to stop them. They bypassed the front desk and headed straight for the executive elevators, their heavy briefcases swinging at their sides. Up in the penthouse suite, Trayvon was frantically pacing the floor of his office, screaming into his cell phone at Vanguard's lead attorney. My father was sitting behind his massive oak desk, staring blankly at the wall, while Dominique was crying hysterically on the leather sofa. Her phone flooded with alerts about Vanguard's sudden financial crisis leaking to the press. The double mahogany doors to the executive suite were suddenly pushed open. The lead Apex litigator, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a completely ruthless expression, marched straight up to my father's desk. She did not introduce herself. She did not offer a handshake. She simply dropped a massive, 3-inch thick stack of heavily bound legal documents directly onto the polished wood surface. The loud thud echoed through the room, silencing Trayvon mid-sentence. Richard Vance, she announced, her voice carrying the terrifying weight of absolute legal destruction. You and the entire executive board of Vanguard Logistics are hereby formally served. My father stared at the massive stack of paper, his hands trembling violently. What is this? He whispered, though he already knew the answer. This is the immediate termination of the $600 million acquisition agreement, the litigator stated coldly, reading from a prepared legal summary. It is also a formal demand for the immediate wire-transferred return of the $50 million good faith deposit by close of business today. We need time, Trevon interrupted, dropping his phone and rushing over to the desk. You cannot just demand $50 million in cash with zero notice. We have a grace period. It is in the contract. The litigator turned her sharp gaze to Trevon, looking at him with pure disdain. The grace period is completely voided in the event of gross commercial deception and intellectual property fraud. But that is not all. She tapped the thick stack of documents with her manicured fingernail. Because your fraudulent actions have caused significant disruption to Apex Global's quarterly projections, and because you intentionally misrepresented the ownership of the core logistics algorithm, we are not just pulling out of the deal. Apex Global is officially filing a civil lawsuit against Vanguard Logistics, Richard Vance, Helena Vance, Trevon Carter, and Dominique Carter personally. We are suing you for $100 million in punitive damages. Dominique let out a piercing scream, dropping her phone onto the floor. My father collapsed back into his leather chair, his face turning an unhealthy ashen shade of gray. We will see you in federal court, the litigator finished. She turned on her heel and marched out of the office, her legal team following closely behind her. The trap had completely closed. The house of cards had finally collapsed, and my family was buried underneath it. 48 hours later, the absolute destruction of Vanguard Logistics was no longer a private family matter. It was front-page news across every major financial publication in the country. The leak had happened overnight, likely from an insider at Apex Global, who recognized the explosive nature of a $100 million fraud lawsuit. By Wednesday morning, the headlines were utterly merciless. Tech giant Apex Global sues Atlanta logistics firm for massive fraud. Vanguard Logistics deal collapses over stolen intellectual property. The immediate financial fallout was catastrophic and completely unavoidable. The moment the New York Stock Exchange opened, the Vanguard company stock, which had been artificially inflated by the rumors of the massive acquisition, went into a terrifying freefall. It opened at $42 a share, and within 3 hours, it had plummeted by 80%, struggling to stay above $4. Decades of my father's carefully cultivated corporate reputation evaporated before lunchtime. The panic was not just limited to the stock market. The banking institutions that had extended massive unsecured lines of credit to my family based on the pending $600 million Apex buyout immediately realized they were holding empty promises. The grace periods were revoked. Creditors began calling in their loans immediately. The bank that held the mortgage on the Vanguard corporate headquarters filed a notice of default. Even worse, the private wealth managers who handled my parents' personal finances began freezing their luxury assets. The massive sprawling estate in Buckhead that Trevon and Dominique had just put a down payment on was immediately seized by the escrow company due to insufficient funds. Inside the Vanguard building, the atmosphere was absolute chaos. Employees were packing their desks knowing the payroll accounts were likely completely frozen. The board of directors was demanding my father's immediate resignation. But the person who was sweating the most, the person who was staring down the barrel of actual terrifying federal consequences, was Trevon. As the chief operating officer, Trevon had proudly attached his signature to dozens of financial disclosures, merger documents, and the fatal intellectual property indemnity clause. He had done it because he wanted the prestige and the massive bonus check, but now those signatures made him personally and legally liable for the fraud. My father, Richard, was a seasoned, ruthless corporate shark. Trevon knew that when the federal investigators came knocking, Richard would not hesitate for a single second to use Trevon as the ultimate scapegoat to save his own skin. Trevon was a man who only cared about his own survival. When the ship began to sink, his first instinct was not to save his wife or his family. His first instinct was to find a life raft, no matter who he had to drown to get it. I was sitting comfortably on the velvet sofa in my living room, sipping herbal tea and watching the Vanguard stock ticker crash on the financial news channel when my cell phone rang. It was an unknown number, likely a burner phone or a secure line, but I answered it anyway. "Nia, please do not hang up the phone," a voice pleaded. I recognized the frantic, breathless tone immediately. It was Trayvon. He sounded like he was hiding in a closet or a stairwell, his voice echoing slightly in the background. "You have a lot of nerve calling me Trayvon," I said smoothly, setting my teacup down on the coffee table. "I would think you would be a little too busy speaking with your criminal defense attorneys to chat with the basement coder." I tapped the screen of my phone, silently activating the high-definition call recording software I had installed years ago. A small red microphone icon began blinking in the corner of my screen, capturing every single word. "Listen to me, Nia, you have to listen to me," Trevon begged, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I know I messed up. I know I treated you terribly. Richard made me do it. He told me if I did not fire you and secure the code, he would force Dominique to divorce me and cut me out of the trust fund. He is a monster, Nia. He orchestrated this entire fraud." I leaned back against the sofa cushions, letting him talk. "That is a fascinating story, Trayvon. But your signature is on the Apex contracts, not just his. The federal prosecutors are going to love seeing your name on the bottom line." "That is exactly why I am calling you," he whispered frantically. "I can help you, Nia. I know you are going to sell the algorithm directly to Apex. You hold all the cards now, but you do not know where Richard and Helena have hidden the rest of their money. You do not know how deep the rot goes." I remained completely silent, letting the dead air force him to keep talking, to keep offering more of his betrayal. "I have proof," Trevon continued, completely taking the bait. "I have copies of the private ledgers. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that Dominique set up to hide her corporate bonuses from the IRS. She has been funneling company money into private shell corporations for 3 years. I have the account numbers, Nia. I have the routing information. I have emails from Richard explicitly telling me to lie to the Apex integration team. I have everything you need to bury them permanently." "And what exactly do you want for this treasure trove of family treason?" I asked, my voice dripping with cold amusement. "I want a deal," he said quickly, his greed temporarily overpowering his fear. "I will hand over everything. I will testify against Richard in federal court. I will testify against Dominique. I will give the Apex legal team everything they need to drop the lawsuit against me. All I want is a piece of the pie when you sell the code. Nothing crazy. Just 5%. Just enough for me to disappear and start over somewhere else. You get your revenge, you get hundreds of millions of dollars, and I hand you the nails for their coffins." I listened to the absolute cowardice in his voice. He was willing to sell out his wife of 5 years, the woman he had smiled and posed with on the cover of magazines, for a tiny fraction of my hard-earned money. He was willing to send his father-in-law to federal prison just to save himself. It was poetic, and it was entirely pathetic. "Let me make sure I understand you clearly, Trayvon," I said, making sure the recording picked up his exact intentions. "You want to hand over your wife's illegal offshore banking records and testify that Richard Vance committed federal wire fraud in exchange for a 5% cut of my software sale?" "Yes," he breathed, sounding incredibly relieved that I was engaging with the offer. "Yes, exactly. We can help each other, Nia. We can destroy them together." I smiled, looking at the blinking red recording icon on my phone. "I do not need your help to destroy them, Trayvon," I said, dropping the conversational tone entirely and letting my voice turn to absolute ice. "They have already destroyed themselves, and I am certainly not paying a premium to a spineless coward who tried to physically assault me in a restaurant 48 hours ago." "Nia, wait, please," Trayvon panicked, raising his voice. "I am not agreeing to anything. There is no deal. Have a wonderful time in federal court, Trayvon." I ended the call before he could say another word. I immediately stopped the recording and saved the high-definition audio file to my encrypted cloud drive. It was a masterpiece of betrayal captured in crystal-clear audio. Trayvon throwing Dominique under the bus, exposing her tax evasion, and offering to completely ruin her parents for a quick payday. I could have sent the audio file to the Apex legal team. I could have sent it to the press. But that would have been too easy. I wanted the destruction to come from the inside out. I wanted the golden child to realize that the perfect life she had flaunted in my face for decades was built on a foundation of absolute lies and surrounded by people who would sell her out in a heartbeat. Across town in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned offices of Atlanta's most expensive bankruptcy and restructuring law firm, Dominique was sitting at a massive mahogany conference table. She looked entirely defeated. She was wearing oversized dark sunglasses to hide her swollen red eyes. Her perfect blonde hair was tied back in a messy bun, and the designer dress she had worn to the office that morning looked wrinkled and sad. Sitting across from her were three stern-looking bankruptcy attorneys. They had just finished explaining the brutal reality of her situation. The $100 million lawsuit from Apex had triggered a complete freeze on all of her domestic assets. Her credit cards were declining. The bank was foreclosing on her luxury condo. Her husband, Trevon, had not answered her frantic phone calls all morning. She was 28 years old. Previously, the glowing face of black corporate excellence, and she was about to be completely penniless. As the lead attorney pushed a massive stack of personal bankruptcy declaration forms across the table toward her, Dominique's cell phone buzzed loudly against the polished wood. She looked down. It was a text message from an unknown blocked number. There was no text. There was only a single audio file attached, simply titled, "The Restructuring Plan." Dominique sniffled, wiping her nose with a tissue. She picked up the phone. Her hands were shaking as she tapped the play button on the audio file, not bothering to lower the volume or lift the phone to her ear. The audio began to play loudly, echoing off the glass walls of the quiet conference room. The attorneys stopped shuffling their papers, looking up in confusion as Trevon's frantic voice filled the space. "I have copies of the private ledgers. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands that Dominique set up to hide her corporate bonuses from the IRS. She has been funneling company money into private shell corporations for 3 years. I have the account numbers, Nia. I have the routing information." Dominique froze. The tissue dropped from her trembling fingers. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened to her husband, the man she had proudly stood beside and mocked me with, completely betray her. The audio continued, crystal clear and absolutely devastating. "I will hand over everything. I will testify against Richard in federal court. I will testify against Dominique. All I want is a piece of the pie when you sell the code." The recording finished with my cold rejection, followed by the sharp click of the phone hanging up. The conference room fell into a horrifying, suffocating silence. The three bankruptcy attorneys stared at Dominique with a mixture of professional alarm and severe legal concern. They had just heard their client get implicated in international tax evasion and federal wire fraud by her own husband. Dominique stared at the blank screen of her cell phone. The pristine, untouchable illusion of her golden life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She realized in that exact moment that she had lost absolutely everything. Her money, her status, her family, and her marriage were entirely gone. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and explain it away to the horrified lawyers sitting across from her, but instead she just buried her face in her hands and began to scream. Dominique did not stay at the law firm to hear the rest of their bankruptcy advice. She grabbed her designer purse, ignored the shouting attorneys, and sprinted out of the glass building to her luxury SUV. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms. The drive back to her sprawling Buckhead condo was a blur of rage and pure terror. When she threw open the front door of her home, she found Trevon in the master bedroom. He had pulled 3 massive luxury suitcases from the walk-in closet and was frantically shoving his expensive tailored suits, designer watches, and imported leather shoes into them. He was moving with the chaotic, uncoordinated energy of a man who knew the authorities were closing in. He did not even look up when she entered the room. Dominique did not say a single word. She did not ask what he was doing. She simply raised her phone, turned the volume all the way to maximum, and hit play on the audio file I had sent her. Trevon froze instantly. His hands stopped mid-air over a pile of silk ties as his own voice filled the massive bedroom, echoing loudly off the high ceilings. He stood completely paralyzed as he listened to himself offering to testify against her, exposing her illegal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and begging me for a 5% cut of the algorithm sale just so he could run away. The recording ended. The silence in the bedroom was thick and completely suffocating. Dominique threw the phone directly at his head with all her strength. It smashed into the wall right behind him, shattering the screen and dropping to the floor. You absolute coward, she shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat, completely losing her polished socialite persona. You spineless, pathetic traitor. We have been married for 5 years. I built your entire career. I elevated you to the executive board. And the second things get hard, you try to sell me out to my own sister just to save yourself. Traven did not cower this time. The cornered rat had nowhere left to run, so he finally dropped the charming, supportive husband mask he had worn for half a decade. He stood up straight, his face twisting into a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. You did not build my career, Dominique, he spat, taking an aggressive step toward her. Your father handed it to me because he knew you were completely incompetent. You are a talentless hack. You spent 5 years parading around in designer clothes taking credit for Nia's actual genius and pretending you were some kind of corporate mastermind. The only reason you even have a title at Vanguard Logistics is pure, unchecked nepotism. You do not know the first thing about business, and you never did. Dominique recoiled, as if he had physically struck her across the face. You are my husband, she gasped, tears of shock streaming down her ruined makeup. We took vows. Not anymore, Trayvon said coldly, turning back to his suitcase and zipping it shut with a harsh sound. I filed the divorce papers electronically an hour ago. My lawyer is having you formally served by the end of the day. Dominique staggered backward, leaning heavily against the doorframe for physical support. Divorce. Trevon, you cannot do this. We are in this together. The federal investigators are coming for both of us. We need to hire a joint defense team. We need to access our savings to fight this lawsuit. Trevin let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. He picked up his heavy suitcase and walked right past her into the hallway. What savings, Dominique? I logged into our joint banking accounts this morning while you were crying in the shower. I drained every single penny we had liquid. I wired it directly to the retainer account of the best criminal defense attorney in Atlanta. I need that money to secure my immunity deal with the federal prosecutors. You stole my money, she screamed, grabbing the sleeve of his jacket, her nails digging into the expensive fabric. It was not your money. Trayvon yanked his arm away violently, sending Dominique crashing to the hardwood floor. It was Vanguard's money. It was Nia's money. You never earned a single dime of it in your entire life. Have a nice life, Dominique. Good luck explaining the offshore shell corporations to the IRS. Trayvon walked out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. Dominique lay on the floor of her empty, silent condo, her chest heaving as she let out a guttural, agonizing scream that no one was around to hear. She did not know how long she stayed on the floor, but eventually the sheer terror of her situation forced her to move. Trayvon had abandoned her. The bankruptcy lawyers had abandoned her. She had exactly one place left to go. Her parents. Richard and Helena always had a plan. Her father always knew how to manipulate the system, leverage his elite connections, and bail her out of trouble. She grabbed her car keys, stumbled out to her SUV, and drove recklessly toward her parents' massive estate in the exclusive Buckhead suburbs. The sky above Atlanta was turning a bruised, ominous purple, threatening a massive summer thunderstorm that matched the chaos in her mind. As Dominique turned onto the long, tree-lined driveway of her parents' property, she slammed on the brakes in absolute shock. There were no luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. Instead, there were 3 massive industrial moving trucks. Dozens of men in uniform jumpsuits were hauling expensive antique furniture, oil paintings, imported rugs, and grand pianos out of the front doors of the mansion. Dominique threw her car into park and sprinted toward the front door, pushing past a mover carrying a heavy crystal chandelier. Mom, Dad, she screamed, running frantically into the grand foyer. The house was practically stripped bare. Richard was sitting on the bottom step of the grand sweeping staircase, his head buried in his hands. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 2 days. He was not wearing a custom-tailored suit. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. Helena was standing near the massive stone fireplace, frantically trying to shove silver picture frames and small valuables into a designer tote bag. She looked up when Dominique ran in, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. Mom. What is happening? Dominique demanded, looking around at the empty walls and bare floors. Where is all the furniture going? Trayvon left me. He filed for divorce and took all the money. The Apex lawyers are freezing everything. I need Dad to call the bank and fix this right now. Helena let out a sharp, hysterical sob, dropping a silver frame onto the floor. There is no bank, Dominique. There is no money left to fix anything. Dominique stared at her mother, completely uncomprehending. What do you mean you and Dad have millions in private wealth? You have this massive house. You are the elite. Richard slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any of the ruthless corporate arrogance that had defined his entire life. We do not have the house, he said, his voice a raspy, broken whisper. I lied to you. I lied to everyone. The Vanguard books were a complete financial disaster for years. We were operating on massive deficits. When Apex demanded a $50 million good faith deposit in cash to secure the acquisition, Vanguard did not have the liquid capital. So I quietly leveraged this estate. I took out a massive high-interest shadow loan, using the house as collateral, assuming the $600 million payout would easily cover the debt by next week. Dominique felt the blood drain entirely from her face, leaving her lightheaded. You bet the family home on a deposit. When Apex canceled the deal and demanded the $50 million back this morning, Richard continued staring blankly at the marble floor. The shadow lenders found out. They do not operate like traditional banks, Dominique. They do not give you 30 days to figure it out or hire lawyers to stall the process. They showed up an hour ago with the eviction paperwork and the moving trucks. They are seizing the property, the physical assets, the cars, everything. We are bankrupt. We are entirely ruined. A loud crack of thunder shook the massive empty house, followed instantly by the heavy torrential downpour of a Georgia summer storm. The rain hammered violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, mimicking the absolute destruction crashing down on their family. Dominique fell to her knees at the bottom of the stairs, right next to her father. The golden child, the perfect corporate executive, was finally reduced to a weeping, penniless mess on the floor of a foreclosed mansion. There was no inheritance. There was no legacy. The generational wealth they had so proudly weaponized against me was nothing but a fragile illusion built entirely on debt, arrogance, and deceit. Across the city, I was completely removed from their chaos. I was sitting at my kitchen island, listening to the soothing sound of the rain lashing against my apartment windows. The kettle was whistling on the stove, and I was casually reviewing the massive contract Apex Global had sent over for the direct purchase of my algorithm. I had already secured my own high-powered legal representation, and the numbers they were discussing were beyond staggering. $400 million, plus a senior executive position at their Silicon Valley headquarters. I had won. I had protected my peace, enforced my boundaries, and secured my future without compromising a single ounce of my dignity. Just as I stood up to pour my hot water, a sudden frantic knocking echoed from my front door. It was not the polite professional knock of a delivery driver or a neighbor. It was desperate. It was the sound of someone frantically pounding their fists against the solid wood. I frowned, tightening the belt of my silk robe. I walked slowly toward the entryway, checking the security monitor mounted on the wall. The camera feed outside my door was slightly obscured by the dark hallway lighting, but I could clearly see the silhouette of a woman standing there, shivering violently. I did not open the door right away. I pressed the intercom button. "Who is it?" I asked calmly. "Please, Nia," a weak, trembling voice responded through the small speaker. "Please open the door." I recognized the voice immediately, even though it was stripped of all its usual condescension and authority. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Standing in the hallway, completely drenched by the pouring rain, was my mother. Helena Vance looked absolutely unrecognizable. The immaculate, perfectly styled matriarch of Atlanta's black elite was entirely gone. Her expensive silk blouse was soaked through and clinging to her shivering frame. Her perfect hair was plastered flat against her face, completely ruined by the brutal storm. But the most shocking detail was what was missing. The heavy diamond necklace she always wore to signify her status was gone. Her diamond tennis bracelets, her pearl earrings, her massive engagement ring. Every single piece of designer jewelry she had worn like armor for 30 years had been stripped away, likely seized by the shadow creditors or sold in a desperate panic just to pay for a taxi across town. She stood there in this cold hallway, hugging herself, water dripping from her clothes and forming a dark puddle on my welcome mat. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from hours of relentless crying. "Nia," she whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "They took everything. Richard is facing a federal indictment. Dominique is being investigated by the IRS. The house is gone. We have absolutely nowhere to go." She took a small, hesitant step forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward my doorframe, as if she were a freezing beggar asking for shelter. "Please," she cried, finally dropping the toxic, strong black woman trope she had wielded against me my entire life. "Please, Naya. You are my daughter. I am begging you. Help us." I stood in the doorway of my warm, quiet apartment and stared at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was completely invisible. The hallway was freezing, and the harsh fluorescent overhead lights cast deep, exhausted shadows across my mother's face. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were actually chattering. The designer silk blouse she had probably paid thousands of dollars for was plastered to her skin, ruined by the torrential Atlanta thunderstorm. I did not step aside to let her in. I kept my hand firmly on the brass doorknob, acting as a physical barrier between my peaceful sanctuary and the absolute chaos she was trying to drag inside. "Nia, please." Helena begged again, her voice cracking as she wrapped her arms around her soaked torso. "You have to let me come inside. I am freezing. We need to talk about this. We can fix this. You just have to give your father the administrative access keys to the routing servers, just for a week. Just long enough for him to show the shadow lenders that the system is fully operational. If they see the predictive algorithm working, they will grant us a bridge loan. We can stall the foreclosure. We can save the estate." I looked at her, truly looking at the desperation in her eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering guilt, no underlying urge to protect her, and no residual desperation for her approval. The emotional cord that had kept me tied to her toxic expectations had been completely severed. "You do not understand how bad it is." She continued, her words rushing out in a panicked, disorganized stream when she realized I was not moving to let her in. "The federal prosecutors have already contacted Richard's legal team. They are talking about wire fraud charges. They are talking about prison time, Nia. Your father cannot survive in a federal penitentiary. And Dominique is a complete wreck. Trevin took everything she had and abandoned her. She has nothing. She is your younger sister. You have to save us. You are the only one who has the power to stop this nightmare." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. "It is fascinating, Mother," I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. "It is truly fascinating how quickly I transformed from a useless basement coder into the all-powerful savior of this family. Just a few days ago, I was an ungrateful brat holding back your historic celebration. Now I am your only hope." Helena reached out her wet, trembling fingers, briefly touching the sleeve of my silk robe. "Do not do this," she pleaded, tears mixing with the rainwater streaming down her face. "Do not be cruel, Nia. I know we made mistakes. I know Richard handled the termination poorly, but we are your family. I gave birth to you. I carried you for 9 months. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot just stand there and watch your own blood relatives lose everything. It goes against everything I ever taught you." I looked down at her hand resting on my sleeve and then looked back up into her eyes until she slowly, awkwardly pulled her hand away. "You did not teach me anything about family, Mother," I replied softly. "You taught me about conditional transactions. You taught me that my value was entirely dependent on what I could silently provide for Dominique's benefit. You talk about flesh and blood right now because you are desperate and cornered. But where was that unbreakable family bond on Tuesday morning?" Helena flinched, looking away from me and staring at the wet welcome mat under her ruined designer shoes. "I did not know Richard was going to bring security guards," she whispered defensively. "I did not know Trayvon was going to be so aggressive." "You stood in the lobby," I continued, cutting through her pathetic excuses with surgical precision. "You stood in the lobby wearing your heavy diamond necklace. You held a glass of expensive champagne at 9 o'clock in the morning, And you watched your son-in-law humiliate me in front of dozens of employees. You watched my father hand me a cardboard box and a $20,000 check for a company I spent 7 years of my life building from scratch. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing her to take a step back into the cold hallway. You told me to take that pathetic check, find a nice little IT job somewhere else, and learn to be grateful. You smiled while Dad told me I was strictly an at-will employee. He legally severed all ties. He explicitly put it in writing that I had zero claims to company assets and zero ongoing affiliation with Vanguard Logistics. You did not care about blood then. You only cared about protecting Dominique's massive payday. I was just trying to keep the peace, Helena cried out, resorting to her ultimate lifelong defense mechanism. I have always had to balance your father's temper with your stubbornness. I am a mother. I was doing the best I could to keep this family together. You were keeping your luxury lifestyle together, I corrected her sharply. And when you realized I was not going to quietly accept my termination and fade into the background, what did you do? Did you call me to apologize? Did you try to protect your flesh and blood then? No. You stood in a church parking lot on Sunday morning and you ordered your corporate lawyers to freeze my checking accounts. You actively tried to starve me out. You tried to make sure I could not pay my rent or buy groceries. You tried to destroy me financially just to force me to surrender my property. Helena let out a loud, agonizing sob, covering her face with her wet hands. She had no defense left. I was holding up a perfect, unforgiving mirror to her lifelong hypocrisy, and she absolutely hated the reflection staring back at her. I am sorry, she wailed, her voice echoing down the empty apartment hallway. I am so sorry, Nia. Please, I will do anything. I will make Richard publicly apologize to you. I will make Dominique transfer her remaining shares to you. Just give us the algorithm. We will lose the house tomorrow if you do not help us. I watched her cry for a long, silent moment. I remembered being 10 years old, sitting in my pale blue bedroom, crying over a harsh reprimand, while she comforted Dominique down the hall for the exact same offense. I remembered the endless stream of holidays, birthdays, and graduations where my achievements were consistently minimized so that Dominique's mediocre accomplishments could take center stage. I realized in that moment that she was not crying because she regretted how she had treated me. She was crying because her actions had finally generated severe consequences and she could not manipulate her way out of them. Hold on, I said quietly. I turned my back on her and walked into my warm apartment, leaving the front door wide open. I walked into the kitchen, pulled a clean, soft tissue from the decorative box on the counter, and walked back to the front door. Helena looked up, a sudden, desperate spark of hope flashing in her red, swollen eyes. She thought my brief departure meant I was going to grab my laptop. She thought she had finally broken through my armor, that the guilt trip had worked, and that I was going to log into the servers and save her. I stopped in the doorway and extended my hand, offering her the single white tissue. She stared at the tissue, the spark of hope instantly dying in her eyes, replaced by a profound, hollow despair. She slowly reached out with a trembling hand and took it from me. You have spent 32 years of your life investing all your love, all your money, and all your loyalty into Dominique, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and completely final. You built an entire empire around the belief that she was the golden child, and I was just the disposable help. I placed my hand firmly on the brass doorknob. You bet on the wrong child, Mother, I said. Before she could utter another word, before she could launch into another desperate plea or shed another manipulative tear, I pushed the heavy wooden door forward. It shut with a loud, solid click, the deadbolt automatically sliding into place. I stood in the entryway of my apartment for a few seconds, listening to the muffled sound of my mother weeping on the other side of the door. And then I walked away. I did not look back. I did not feel a single shred of remorse. I walked into my living room, tightened my robe, and sat down on my velvet sofa, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The suffocating chains of generational guilt were permanently broken. Less than 10 minutes later, as the heavy rain continued to wash over the city of Atlanta, the silence of my apartment was broken by the sharp, crisp ringing of my cell phone resting on the coffee table. I reached over and picked it up. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but the area code was 650, Palo Alto, California, the heart of Silicon Valley. I took a sip of my warm herbal tea, cleared my throat, and swiped the green accept button on the screen. "Hello, this is Nia," I answered smoothly, projecting absolute professional confidence. "Ms. Nia," a deep, resonant voice spoke on the other end of the line. The voice was calm, authoritative, and completely lacking the frantic desperation I had grown so accustomed to hearing over the past 48 hours. "My name is Julian Sterling. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global." I smiled, settling back into the soft cushions of my sofa. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. I have been expecting your call." "I imagine you have," Julian replied, a hint of genuine respect coloring his tone. "I apologize for calling so late, but given the rather dramatic collapse of our acquisition proceedings in Atlanta today, my executive board felt it was imperative that we reach out to you directly. Our lead auditor, David Preston, gave us a very detailed and highly entertaining report regarding your dinner conversation at the Capitol Grill." "David is a very observant man," I noted, keeping my tone light but professional. "I assume he informed you that Vanguard Logistics does not own the predictive routing algorithm your engineering team requires." "He made that abundantly clear," Julian said. "He also made it clear that you are the sole registered owner of Encore LLC and that you single-handedly engineered the artificial intelligence that reduced Vanguard's operational costs by 40% over the last fiscal year." "That is correct," I confirmed. "Ms. Nia," Julian continued, his voice shifting into a strictly business cadence, "Apex Global has absolutely no interest in acquiring a failing trucking company burdened by massive debt and fraudulent executives. We were only ever interested in the technology. We want the algorithm, and more importantly, we want the architect who built it." I remained silent, letting him lay the cards on the table. "I am having my private jet fueled and prepped on the tarmac right now," Julian said. "I would like to personally invite you to fly out to our Silicon Valley headquarters tomorrow morning. We have a fully prepared 9-figure acquisition contract waiting for your review. We want to discuss the direct purchase of your intellectual property, as well as a senior executive position for you on our global logistics board. We want to have a very private, very lucrative conversation regarding the future of logistics. Are you available to travel tomorrow?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the massive surge of adrenaline flooding my system. "I am absolutely available to travel tomorrow morning." "Excellent," the CEO of Apex Global responded smoothly. "My executive assistant will email you the flight itinerary and the gate details within the next 5 minutes. Get some rest, Nia. Tomorrow is going to be a very significant day for your career." I ended the call, set the phone down on my coffee table, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The heavy rain continued to batter the windows of my apartment, but inside the atmosphere felt entirely different. The suffocating gray cloud that had hung over my life for 32 years had finally lifted. The next morning, a sleek black town car was waiting at the curb outside my apartment building before the sun had even fully risen. The driver respectfully loaded my overnight bag into the trunk and opened the door for me. I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue power suit that I had purchased a few months prior, using my independent consulting money. I looked exactly like the corporate executive my family had always insisted I could never be. The town car bypassed the chaotic commercial terminals at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport and drove directly onto the private tarmac. A pristine white Gulfstream jet, bearing the discreet Apex Global logo, was waiting for me. As I stepped onto the aircraft, the flight attendant greeted me by name, handed me a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, and directed me to a plush leather seat. For the entire 4-hour flight across the country, I reviewed the preliminary contract Apex had securely emailed to me. The numbers printed on the digital pages were so astronomically high they almost did not feel real. When the jet touched down in San Jose, California, the brilliant mid-morning Silicon Valley sun was a stark contrast to the miserable storms I had left behind in Atlanta. Another private driver whisked me away, driving me toward the sprawling, ultra-modern Apex Global corporate campus in Palo Alto. The Apex headquarters was an architectural marvel. It looked less like a traditional corporate office and more like a futuristic city. Massive buildings constructed entirely of curved glass and eco-friendly steel were surrounded by manicured green spaces, walking trails, and autonomous electric shuttles ferrying tech workers between sectors. I walked through the towering glass doors of the primary executive building, stepping into a massive sunlit lobby that felt as large as an airplane hangar. The space was sleek and minimalist, featuring a massive indoor waterfall and sleek white furniture. I approached the front reception desk, handed the security personnel my identification, and was directed to wait in the VIP lounge area while the board finished their morning briefings. I walked over to the lounge, ordered a cup of artisan green tea from the complimentary lobby cafe, and turned to find a seat. That was when I saw them. Sitting in the far corner of the massive lobby, huddled together on a modern white leather sofa, was my family. If I had not been looking directly at them, I might not have even recognized them. The absolute physical and emotional toll of the last 72 hours had completely ravaged Richard, Helena, and Dominique. They looked incredibly haggard, completely stripped of the wealthy, untouchable elite aura they had paraded around in for decades. My father was wearing a suit, but it was not one of his custom Italian masterpieces. It looked like an older, ill-fitting backup suit that he had hastily packed. It was horribly wrinkled, likely because they had been forced to fly across the country on a commercial red-eye flight after their private accounts were frozen. His face was deeply lined, his posture was slumped, and his eyes were dark and hollow. My mother sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly at the floor. She was wearing a plain, nondescript beige dress. Without her heavy diamond jewelry, her flawless makeup, and her expensive salon blowouts, she looked incredibly fragile and remarkably old. And then there was Dominique, the golden child, the magazine cover model, the former chief marketing officer of Vanguard Logistics. She was completely unrecognizable. Her usually pristine blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, unwashed knot. She was wearing a cheap, oversized gray sweater and plain black leggings, likely the only unseized clothing she could grab before the shadow creditors locked her out of her condo. Her face was puffy and red, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing tech campus. Trayvon was nowhere to be found, completely making good on his promise to abandon her to the federal authorities. I did not approach them. I simply took a seat on a plush chair a few yards away, elegantly crossing my legs and taking a slow, calming sip of my green tea. It only took a few seconds for my father to notice me. Richard lifted his heavy head, his hollow eyes scanning the lobby before locking directly onto my face. For a brief second, shock registered on his features, but then, as if by pure muscle memory, the toxic delusional arrogance that had ruined his life flared up one final time. He abruptly stood up from the sofa, smoothing down his wrinkled suit jacket, and marched over to where I was sitting. Helena and Dominique immediately looked up, their eyes widening as they realized I was in the same room, and they quickly followed right behind him. "Well, well, well," Richard sneered, stopping a few feet away from my chair. His voice was raspy, lacking its usual booming authority, but the condescension was still perfectly intact. "I was wondering when reality was going to finally catch up with you, Nia." I lowered my teacup and looked up at him, maintaining a completely neutral expression. "Hello, Richard." He pointed a shaking finger at me, a bitter, vicious smile spreading across his pale face. "You really thought you were so incredibly smart, did you not? You thought you could steal corporate property, hold $1 billion tech conglomerate hostage, and just walk away clean? Did you actually believe Apex Global would let a little basement coder play games with their intellectual property?" I did not say a word. I just watched him dig his own grave, fascinated by his absolute refusal to accept the reality of his situation. "We were summoned here today to sign federal bankruptcy and civil settlement papers." My father continued, leaning closer to me, his voice dripping with venom. "Apex is forcing us to liquidate the entire empty shell of Vanguard Logistics just to pay off the fraud penalties, so your mother and I can avoid going to a federal penitentiary. They took absolutely everything from us. But seeing you sitting here waiting to face their corporate lawyers makes it slightly more tolerable." Dominique stepped out from behind our father, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "They are going to sue you into the ground, Nia," she hissed, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. You breached their security network. You committed corporate sabotage. You are going to end up in a federal prison cell, and you deserve every single second of it. If you had just signed that contract at the restaurant, none of this would be happening. Helena stood silently in the background, her eyes darting nervously toward the massive frosted glass doors of the executive suite. She did not yell at me, perhaps remembering how firmly I had shut the door in her face the night before. But she did not stop her husband or her golden child from verbally attacking me either. They got you too, my father said, letting out a harsh, breathless laugh. The mighty Nia finally getting exactly what she deserves. I hope their lawyers tear you apart. I slowly placed my teacup on the small glass table next to my chair. I looked at my father, then at my sister, and finally at my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not try to explain the copyright laws to them again. I simply offered them a calm, perfectly serene smile. Before Richard could launch into another delusional tirade, a loud, electronic chime echoed through the massive lobby. The towering frosted glass double doors leading to the inner executive suite smoothly slid open. A heavy, intimidating silence instantly fell over the lobby. A team of 6 high-powered corporate attorneys in immaculate dark suits walked out first, fanning out slightly to clear the pathway. Behind them walked Julian Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Global. He was a tall, strikingly distinguished man in his early 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit without a tie, projecting the ultimate image of Silicon Valley power and effortless authority. Richard instantly panicked. His toxic bravado vanished in a millisecond. He frantically tried to smooth his wrinkled jacket again, wiping his sweaty palms on his slacks. He plastered a desperate, sickeningly submissive smile onto his face and quickly stepped forward, completely blocking my line of sight. Julian. Richard called out, his voice cracking slightly as he practically lunged forward with his right hand extended for a handshake. Julian, thank you so much for agreeing to see us today. I assure you my legal team is fully prepared to sign the settlement and transfer all remaining Vanguard assets immediately. We want to cooperate fully with your fraud division. Julian Sterling did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand. He did not even look at my father's face. The billionaire CEO walked right past Richard as if my father were nothing more than an invisible speck of dust floating in the air. Richard's outstretched hand hung awkwardly in the empty space, his desperate smile freezing on his face. Julian walked smoothly around my stunned parents and stopped directly in front of my chair. I stood up, brushing a microscopic piece of lint from my navy blue blazer. Julian Sterling's stern, authoritative expression instantly melted into a warm, incredibly respectful smile. He extended his hand toward me. Nia, it is an absolute pleasure to finally meet the brilliant architect in person, Julian said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby, making sure every single syllable was heard by the 3 people standing frozen behind me. I shook his hand firmly, matching his confident grip. Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Sterling, I replied smoothly. Your private aviation team was incredibly accommodating. Julian chuckled, gesturing toward the open glass doors of the executive suite. Please call me Julian. My aviation team is at your disposal for the return trip to Atlanta or anywhere else you might decide to relocate after today. He turned slightly, finally acknowledging the existence of my family, though he only looked at them with a brief, icy glance of pure professional disdain before turning his full attention back to me. Ms. Nia, Julian said, sweeping his arm toward the boardroom. The executive board is ready for you. Let us go talk about a 9-figure deal. I heard a sharp, collective gasp from behind me. I glanced over my shoulder one final time. Richard's jaw had literally dropped, his mouth hanging open in complete and utter shock. Helena was gripping the back of the white leather sofa to keep her knees from giving out. Dominique was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes, the soul-crushing realization finally hitting her that I was not there to be sued. I was there to be crowned. Lead the way, Julian, I said, turning my back on my ruined family and walking confidently through the glass doors to claim the empire I had built. The glass double doors closed silently behind Julian and me, completely cutting off the ambient noise of the lobby. The executive boardroom was breathtaking. It was a massive, sleek space dominated by a long table carved from a single piece of dark, polished walnut. The exterior wall offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Silicon Valley hills, while the interior wall was entirely made of clear, soundproof smart glass. Through that glass partition, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the waiting area outside. My father, my mother, and my sister were sitting there completely trapped in their own personal purgatory as they waited for the Apex litigation team to serve them their bankruptcy settlement papers. Two large corporate security guards stood near their sofa, ensuring they did not wander the campus. Julian gestured to a plush leather chair right next to the head of the table. "Please have a seat, Naya." I sat down, crossing my legs and resting my hands calmly on the polished walnut surface. The six high-powered corporate attorneys who had followed us inside took their respective seats around the table, opening their laptops and arranging their legal briefs. There was no hostility in this room. There was only the quiet, focused energy of massive wealth about to change hands. Julian sat at the head of the table, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. He looked at me with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine curiosity. "I want to be entirely transparent with you, Nia," he began, his deep voice filling the quiet room. "Apex Global never actually cared about Vanguard Logistics as a company. Your father was running a crumbling, outdated dinosaur of an operation. His trucks were old, his warehouses were inefficient, and his management style was toxic. We knew all of that. We had done our preliminary research long before we ever approached him with a buyout offer." I nodded, understanding perfectly. "You just wanted the network architecture," I said. "Exactly." Julian smiled, leaning back in his chair. "We were going to buy Vanguard, gut the executive board, sell off the physical assets, and keep the predictive artificial intelligence algorithm. The software you built is light years ahead of anything currently on the market. It predicts supply chain disruptions, reroutes fleets in real time based on weather and traffic patterns, and optimizes fuel consumption with terrifying accuracy. Your father thought we were buying his legacy. We were just buying a very expensive wrapper to get to your code." Julian paused, glancing through the glass partition at my father, who was pacing nervously in the waiting area, shooting venomous glares in our direction. When our lead auditor informed me that Vanguard did not actually own the wrapper, Julian continued, turning his attention back to me. I was admittedly furious. But then he explained the situation with Encore LLC. He explained that a single developer, a woman who had been completely marginalized by her own company, held the exclusive copyright to the most valuable logistics tool in the country. And suddenly I was no longer angry. I was excited. Because doing business directly with a brilliant engineer is infinitely better than doing business with a fraudulent middleman. Julian nodded to the lead attorney sitting across from him. The lawyer slid a thick, beautifully bound portfolio across the polished walnut table until it rested directly in front of me. I opened the portfolio. Resting on top of the crisp white pages was a sleek silver fountain pen. "We are not going to insult you with a lowball offer," Julian said, his tone shifting into pure, unadulterated business. "We know exactly what your intellectual property is worth, and we know exactly how much money it is going to generate for Apex Global over the next decade. The contract in front of you is a direct acquisition agreement for Encore LLC." I looked down at the bold numbers printed on the summary page. I had prepared myself for a massive figure, but seeing it written out in stark black ink took my breath away for a fraction of a second. "Apex Global will purchase the exclusive right source code and administrative access to your predictive algorithm for $400 million, Julian stated calmly. "That amount will be paid in a combination of liquid capital and premium stock options, transferring immediately upon your signature." I kept my face perfectly composed, though my heart was beating with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. "But we do not just want the software," Julian added, leaning forward again. "Technology requires vision to evolve. We want the visionary. If you sign that document, you will also be officially appointed as the Vice President of Artificial Intelligence for our Global Logistics Division. You will have a corner office in this building, a dedicated team of 50 senior engineers at your disposal, and a starting base salary of $2 million a year, plus performance bonuses." I looked at the contract. Then I slowly looked up and turned my head toward the soundproof glass partition. Richard was standing near the glass, staring into the boardroom. He could not hear a single word of our conversation, but he was a seasoned corporate shark. He could read the body language. He saw the expensive portfolio. He saw the silver pen. He saw the apex attorneys nodding respectfully in my direction. He knew exactly what was happening. He was watching his discarded, unappreciated daughter secure the exact generational wealth that he had just spectacularly lost. Helena was weeping into a tissue completely broken. Dominique was staring at the floor, clutching her cheap sweater, finally realizing that she would spend the rest of her life working for a fraction of what I was about to make in a single signature. I picked up the silver fountain pen. The metal was cool and heavy in my hand. It felt like the weight of my entire past, finally being converted into my absolute freedom. I did not hesitate. I did not ask for a moment to think about it. I flipped to the final page of the contract, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed my full legal name with a bold, sweeping stroke. I placed the pen down and pushed the portfolio back across the table. "Welcome to Apex Global NIA," Julian said, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his face. He stood up and extended his hand. I stood up and shook his hand. I felt a surge of absolute electricity course through my veins. I had done it. I had beaten their manipulation. I had survived their financial starvation tactics, and I had built my own empire entirely on my own intellect and resilience. "Congratulations, Ms. Nia," the lead attorney said, collecting the signed documents. "The funds will be securely wired to your primary accounts within the hour." Before I could even reply, a loud, violent commotion erupted directly outside the boardroom. Through the soundproof glass, I saw my father completely lose his mind. The realization that the deal was finalized, that I had just signed away the algorithm that he firmly believed belonged to him, broke whatever fragile thread of sanity he had left. He shoved past one of the Apex security guards, completely catching the large man off guard, and lunged for the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. "Hey, you cannot go in there!" the receptionist yelled, jumping out from behind her desk. Richard ignored her. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy doors, bursting into the quiet sanctuary of the executive boardroom. The soundproofing seal broke, and his booming, furious voice instantly shattered the calm atmosphere. "You cannot do this!" Richard screamed, his face a bright, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were bulging so far out they looked like they might burst. He marched aggressively toward the walnut table, completely ignoring the billionaire CEO standing right next to me. Two massive security guards immediately rushed into the room behind him, grabbing him by both arms and forcefully dragging him to a halt just a few feet away from where I was standing. "Let go of me!" Richard roared, struggling wildly against their iron grips. His wrinkled suit jacket tore slightly at the shoulder, but he did not care. He locked his crazed, hollow eyes directly onto mine. "That is my money. You cannot cut me out of this NIA. I demand 50% of whatever they just paid you." 50%. Julian Sterling frowned, looking at my father as if he were a rabid animal that had just wandered into a high-end restaurant. "Escort Mr. Vance back to the waiting area," Julian commanded the guards. "If he resists, call the local police and have him arrested for trespassing." "No," Richard shouted, planting his feet firmly on the carpet, refusing to be moved. "You owe me, Nia. I raised you. I put a roof over your head when you were a child. I paid for your food. I paid for your clothes. The only reason you even know how to code is because I bought you your first computer. I gave you the server room in my building. I gave you a job when you dropped out of your master's program." He was practically foaming at the mouth, spitting his desperate delusional demands across the room. "You built that code under my roof," he bellowed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "You used Vanguard electricity. You used Vanguard resources. That makes it a Vanguard asset. That makes it my asset. I am your father. You are supposed to honor me. You are supposed to protect this family. You cannot just take $400 million and leave us to rot in federal prison." I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had terrorized me for 3 decades humiliate himself in front of the most powerful executives in Silicon Valley. He was completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. He was nothing but a desperate, greedy man throwing a temper tantrum because his favorite toy had finally grown teeth and bitten back. The security guards yanked his arms hard, forcing him to stumble backward. "Wait," I said calmly, raising my hand. The guards paused, looking to Julian for confirmation. Julian gave a curt nod, allowing my father to stay in the room for just a moment longer. Richard stopped struggling, panting heavily. A sick, hopeful gleam flashed in his eyes. He actually thought his screaming had worked. He thought the heavy guilt trip, the mention of raising me and buying my childhood food, had finally pierced my armor. He thought I was going to ask the lawyers to rewrite the contract and hand him $200 million. I picked up my teacup from the table, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked him directly in the eyes. "You did not raise me, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that echoed clearly across the silent boardroom. "You tolerated me. You provided the absolute bare minimum legal requirements of a guardian, and then you spent the next 30 years treating me like an unpaid employee. You bought me a computer when I was 12 so I would stop asking for your attention while you played golf with your executives." His hopeful expression instantly crumbled, replaced by absolute shock. As for Vanguard's resources, I continued stepping around the table until I was standing just a few feet in front of him. "I built the core algorithm at Spelman College on my own personal laptop, and when I came to work for you, I saved your dying company from bankruptcy. I paid you back for every single meal, every single piece of clothing, and every single watt of electricity 1,000 times over. My debt to you is paid in full." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only he and the guards could hear the absolute finality in my words. "You told me on Tuesday that I was an at-will employee with zero equity. I am just following your corporate restructuring plan. I owe you absolutely nothing, and you are getting exactly what you earned. Nothing." I stood up straight and looked at the security guards. "Take him out. He is trespassing on my company's property." The two massive security guards immediately tightened their grips on my father's arms, preparing to drag him backward out of the executive boardroom. Richard thrashed violently, his expensive dress shoes slipping uselessly against the polished hardwood floor. He was completely out of his mind with desperation, his face purple and slick with cold sweat. "Wait!" Richard screamed, planting his feet again and twisting his torso to face the apex attorneys sitting silently around the walnut table. "You cannot ignore the law. I am her father. I provided the initial capital for her education. I provided the servers she used to build the prototype. Under federal intellectual property guidelines, Vanguard Logistics is entitled to a minimum of 50% of this buyout. You cannot just cut a massive check to a rogue employee and leave the parent company out in the cold. I will sue Apex Global. I will tie this algorithm up in federal litigation for a decade." Julian Sterling let out a tired sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at his lead attorney, silently asking if this delusional man had any actual legal ground to stand on. The attorney shook his head imperceptibly, confirming that Richard was grasping at absolutely nothing. "Hold on," I said, raising my hand one more time to pause the security guards. I did not want to leave a single shred of hope in my father's mind. I did not want him flying back to Atlanta thinking he had a valid lawsuit, or a glimmer of a chance to steal what I had rightfully earned. I wanted to completely annihilate his delusion with the exact weapon he had used against me. I reached down to the floor and picked up my leather purse. I unzipped the side pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. It was slightly crumpled at the edges, having been shoved into my blazer pocket during the confrontation in the Vanguard lobby just a few days ago. I unfolded the paper and smoothed it out on the polished walnut table, placing it right next to the massive $400 million acquisition contract I had just signed with Apex Global. "Do you recognize this document, Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Richard stopped struggling against the guards. His chest heaved as he stared down at the piece of paper. His eyes darted across the corporate letterhead, instantly recognizing the bold Vanguard Logistics logo printed at the top. It was the severance check receipt and the formal termination notice. I placed my index finger on the second paragraph and slowly dragged it across the heavy black ink. "Let me read this out loud just so we are all on the exact same page regarding my legal affiliation with your company." I cleared my throat, ensuring my projection was flawless. It states effective immediately the employee, Nia Vance, is terminated at will. The employee accepts a severance payment of $20,000 in exchange for the total dissolution of all corporate ties. The employee is terminated with zero equity, zero claims to any company assets, and zero ongoing affiliation with Vanguard Logistics or its executive board. I looked up from the paper. Richard was staring at me, his mouth slightly open, his breathing completely suspended. The color had utterly vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "You forced me to sign this paper on Tuesday morning," I continued, my voice echoing off the soundproof glass walls of the boardroom. "You stood in the lobby with Trayvon and Dominique surrounded by armed guards, and you proudly shoved this document into my chest. You were so incredibly desperate to avoid giving me the 20% equity you promised me 7 years ago. You thought you were pulling off the ultimate corporate theft. You thought you were securing the entire $600 million Apex buyout for yourself and tossing me out onto the street with absolutely nothing." I picked up the paper and held it in the air, forcing him to look at his own signature scrawled at the bottom. "But you were too arrogant to read the fine print of your own master plan," I said, every word hitting him like a physical blow. "You legally severed all ties with me to save a few bucks. You explicitly stated in a legally binding corporate document drafted by your own lawyers that I have zero ongoing affiliation with you. You completely dissolved our professional relationship. You signed away your rights to my money." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The Apex attorneys looked at each other, some of them actually fighting back small, amused smiles. Julian Sterling leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, watching the absolute destruction of a corporate fraudster with genuine satisfaction. "You fired me," I reminded him, my tone dropping to a cold, unforgiving whisper. "And by firing me, you legally untethered my personal intellectual property from your crumbling company. If you had just kept your word, if you had just treated me like a human being and honored your promise, you would be walking out of this building today with $80 million. But your greed was so massive, it blinded you. You played yourself, Richard." Richard's legs finally gave out. He did not completely collapse to the floor because the two massive security guards were holding him up by his armpits, but all the strength completely left his body. He hung there between them, a broken, ruined man. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, or to threaten, but absolutely no sound came out. His brain had finally processed the catastrophic reality of his own actions. He had locked himself out of the kingdom forever. I turned my attention away from the pathetic shell of my father and looked toward the soundproof glass partition. Helena and Dominique were standing right on the other side of the glass. They had watched the entire exchange. They could not hear the words, but they saw me hold up the termination paper. They saw Richard physically collapse. They knew exactly what had just happened. Helena pressed her hands against the glass, tears streaming down her face, silently mouthing my name over and over again. Dominique looked like she was going to be physically sick. The golden child was finally realizing that the endless well of family money had completely dried up, and she was left with absolutely nothing but a looming federal tax evasion investigation. I turned back to Julian Sterling. The billionaire CEO was watching me with a look of profound respect. He had seen countless executives negotiate, fight, and argue over the years, but he had never seen someone systematically dismantle their enemies with such precise, calculated grace. "Julian," I said, maintaining my professional composure, "as the newly appointed Vice President of Artificial Intelligence for Global Logistics, I believe I have the authority to issue administrative orders regarding campus security. Is that correct?" Julian smiled warmly, a dangerous glint in his eye. "That is absolutely correct, Nia. As a senior executive, the security of this facility is completely at your discretion. What would you like to do?" I looked at the two security guards holding my father, and then I looked out at the waiting area where my mother and sister were weeping. "I exercise my first administrative order," I announced clearly. "I want these three individuals permanently removed from the Apex Global campus. They are a security risk and a massive distraction to our daily operations. Escort them out through the main lobby. Do not let them take the private service elevators." The security guards nodded simultaneously. "Yes, ma'am." The guards hauled Richard backward, dragging his limp, unresisting body out of the executive boardroom and into the waiting area. As soon as the doors opened, the sound of Helena's loud, hysterical sobbing flooded into the room. "Richard," she shrieked, rushing forward to grab her husband's arm. "Richard, what happened? What did she say? Do we get a cut? Tell me she is helping us." Richard did not answer her. He just stared blankly ahead, completely unresponsive. Two additional Apex security guards stepped forward from the waiting area, firmly grabbing Helena and Dominique by their shoulders. "Let us go, ladies," one of the guards ordered sternly. "You are trespassing on private property. Move toward the exit immediately." Dominique tried to fight back her misplaced entitlement, flaring up one final time. "Get your hands off me," she screamed, swatting at the guard's arm. "Do you know who I am? I am the Chief Marketing Officer of Vanguard Logistics. I will have you fired. I will sue this entire company." The guard did not even blink. He just tightened his grip on her arm and forcibly marched her forward. "There is no Vanguard Logistics anymore, ma'am. Keep moving." I stood inside the boardroom, watching through the clear glass as the security team systematically corralled my ruined family. They marched them out of the waiting area and forced them to walk down the massive open-air staircase that led directly into the primary Apex lobby. It was exactly noon. The towering glass lobby was completely packed with hundreds of tech executives, software engineers, and venture capitalists returning from their lunch breaks. It was the absolute epicenter of Silicon Valley power and influence. And right in the middle of it all, my family was publicly paraded like common criminals. Richard was practically dragged across the white marble floor, his suit torn, his shoes scuffing the pristine stone. Helena was weeping loudly, trying to hide her face behind her hands as hundreds of people stopped to stare. Dominique was stumbling along beside them in her cheap, oversized sweater, looking absolutely unhinged as she continued to scream empty threats at the security guards. Every single person in the massive lobby stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. High-powered executives pointed and whispered. Engineers pulled out their smartphones and started recording the humiliating eviction. The family that had spent their entire lives obsessed with their elite public image, the family that had demanded absolute perfection and ruthlessly punished me for any perceived flaw, was being publicly humiliated in front of the most influential people in the country. They were thrown out through the main revolving doors, stumbling onto the hot California pavement. The heavy glass doors locked securely behind them. They were completely locked out of the empire I was about to rule. I watched them disappear into the glaring sunlight, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure wash over my entire soul. The battle was completely over. The ghosts of my past were permanently exiled. I turned away from the glass and looked back at the walnut table. The $400 million contract sat there bearing my signature. Julian Sterling stood up and raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. "Welcome to the future, Nia," he said. "Thank you, Julian," I replied, pulling my chair out to sit back down. "Let us get to work." Getting to work with Apex Global was the easiest transition of my entire life. The hardest part, or so I initially thought, would be watching the inevitable fallout of my family's total collapse. But as the months rolled by, I realized I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I only felt a profound, unwavering sense of justice. The karma that came for my family was absolute. Federal authorities did not take kindly to Trevon's attempts to cut an immunity deal. Because his signature was stamped on fraudulent indemnity documents, and because Vanguard Logistics had no liquid assets left to seize, the Department of Justice made a severe example of him. He was indicted for multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate conspiracy. The man who loved his custom suits and executive titles was sentenced to 8 years in a federal prison facility. He tried to reach out to me once, sending a letter through his public defender begging for a character reference to reduce his sentence. I dropped the envelope into the shredder without even opening it. His cowardice did not save him. It only guaranteed that he faced his ruin completely alone. As for my parents, their descent from the pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite was spectacular. The shadow lenders finalized the foreclosure on their Buckhead estate. The luxury cars, the antique furniture, and even my mother's designer wardrobe were auctioned off to cover a tiny fraction of their debts. Today, Richard and Helena are living in a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. They have been entirely shunned by the country clubs and the social circles they used to rule. When my father walks down the street, the men who used to beg him for investment advice now cross the road to avoid making eye contact. My mother spends her days sitting in a small linoleum kitchen complaining to anyone who will listen. But her audience is gone. The friends she prioritized over her own daughter will not even return her phone calls. Dominique's fall from grace was the most poetic justice. With her offshore accounts frozen by the IRS and her resume exposed as a fabricated lie, she could not secure a job in any corporate sector. The golden child who used to grace the covers of business magazines and take credit for my sleepless nights is now working as a retail cosmetics associate at a high-end department store. 6 days a week, she is required to wear a black uniform and a plastic name tag. She stands behind a glass counter, forced to apply makeup and fetch sample perfumes for the wealthy socialites she used to look down on. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she regularly has to serve the women who used to attend her dinner parties. She has to force a stiff smile and ask if they need help finding their foundation shade, while they hand her their credit cards and offer her condescending looks of pity. Meanwhile, my life has become a reflection of the peace I fought for. I did not just take the executive position at Apex Global, I thrived. Within a year, my division revolutionized the company's logistical efficiency, cementing my status as one of the top minds in the industry. I purchased a stunning luxury penthouse in California, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the ocean. But the most valuable thing in my life is not the $400 million payout, the impressive title, or the real estate portfolio. It is the people sitting around my dining table. Tonight, my penthouse is filled with laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the aroma of a private chef preparing a 5-course meal. I am hosting a dinner party for my chosen family. These are the brilliant mentors who guided my career, the friends who supported me when I was working late nights in a basement, and the women who reminded me of my worth when my own mother tried to strip it away. We are not bound by obligation or the chains of blood. We are bound by mutual respect, unwavering support, and love. I look around my dining room, raising a glass of wine to the people who truly matter, and I realize that I finally have the family I always deserved. I want to take a moment to step back from this story and speak directly to you. For a very long time, I believed that enduring abuse was the price I had to pay to be part of my family. I let them minimize my achievements, steal my labor, and disrespect my boundaries because society tells us that family is everything. But I learned the hard way that loyalty should never be a one-way street, leading to your own destruction. Never let anyone, even blood, convince you that you are just the help in a kingdom you built. You deserve to be celebrated, not tolerated. You deserve to own the fruits of your labor, and you deserve a life free from people who only view you as a resource to be exploited. It is painful to walk away from the people who raised you, but sometimes burning a toxic bridge is the only way to light your path forward. Have you ever had to make the decision to cut off toxic family members in order to protect your peace? How did you find the strength to walk away? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. We gain strength from hearing each other speak the truth. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own power today. Thank you for listening.